Within the Mega Man community, most people know Inti Creates for developing the Mega Man 0 and ZX titles, along with Mega Man 9 and 10. However, they once made a contribution to the Battle Network series as well, albeit it was Mega Man Battle Chip Challenge, a game that people will argue is the worst Battle Network spin-off of all time because of its departure from the action RPG gameplay the main series is known for, instead opting for a fully turn-based battle system where you make the best deck that you can, then watch the showdown unfold with little to no interactivity from the player to influence the outcome. Aside from the 2 slot-in chips that the GBA version gives you anyway, you don't even get that in Wonder Swan, good luck in that version. But hey, at least the soundtrack was a banger. Well, it took a whole 20 years since then, and here we are in 2024. Inti Creates now making their grand return to the card battling RPG genre with their new IP, Card-en-Ciel. Out digitally on Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One and Series S and X, and Steam starting October 24th. Now, I've already done a preview video last month when the Steam demo dropped that goes over the basic gameplay, story setup, and my first impressions. And even after finishing the full game now, I still stand by what I said in that video. So I will leave a link to that in the description. Maybe you want to watch that one first for a concise view on the game, because right here, this is the full review, baby. We're gonna go super in depth, so buckle in. There is one big change for this final review. Instead of the Steam version that I played last time, Inti Creates has provided me with a Nintendo Switch copy for review. But of course, as always, my thoughts are all my own. The Switch port does differ quite a bit in performance from the Steam version, which I will go into detail towards the end. So if you notice the footage looking worse compared to the preview, that's why. Lastly, while I will give some thoughts on the story and characters, there will be no major plot spoilers. I'm embargoed from showing anything from beyond the halfway point anyways. Nevertheless, I invite you to use the video chapters to skip past the story segment if need be. And hey, if you already watched the preview, maybe you want to skip on over to the Grand Battle Dungeon section or the PvP section, since those are the main attractions in terms of new content. In the meantime, I do have plans to stream that first half of the game I am allowed to show a bit later, so stay tuned for details on that. With the introductions out of the way then, time to put on a prismatic show. In essence, Card-en-Ciel can be described as a Slay the Spire clone, and all of its roguelite card game glory, but overlaid on top of a Mega Man Battle Network style battlefield using the familiar 6x3 grid. That latter detail being the whole reason that I'm covering this game. However, it's obviously not one-to-one to Battle Network. Heck, there isn't even a custom gauge. It's all turn-based all the time, baby, resulting in a much slower paced game, with an emphasis on carefully thinking several moves ahead. But on the surface, it can look close enough to the part as players traverse isometric dungeon maps, find mystery data, treasure chests, and battle enemies to acquire new cards until your deck is powerful enough to decimate the bosses at the end of each floor. Then you head back to base with your rewards to power up and rinse and repeat. That's the loop. But who is this Neon Nanashki fellow anyway? In a world where crimes happening in virtual reality are on the rise, Neon is the gaming chair detective. Or more like the rainbow chair detective with an RGB setup that would make any gamer super jelly. Neon's job is to full dive into the virtual worlds of different video games and servers to solve crimes that happen within them. The story begins with Neon receiving a mysterious email that leads him to the in-development Rust Tactics game, where he finds the sender, Ansi, being attacked by Mad Obstructive Data, or mods for short. For anyone who is familiar with Mega Man X Dive, mods are a lot like the deep log errors from that game. You have characters from completely different games popping up in the wrong games and causing trouble. Sound familiar? So, after the initial rescue, Neon and Ansi agreed to work together to solve the mystery of the mod phenomenon by diving into dungeons themed after both fictional games created specifically for Card-en-Ciel and even real-life Inti games, which are specifically Azure Striker Gunvolt, Gunvolt Chronicles Luminous Adventure X, Galgun, Gal Guardians Demon Purge, Umbra Claw, and Bokura no Kingdom. What the heck is that? Well, it's a mobile game that Inti released in 2011, but has since reached end of service. Nevertheless, it's now been officially localized to Kingdom's Return for this game. That's pretty neat. Oh, and Divine Dynamo Flamefrit is now a real game too. Maybe we'll play that on stream in the near future. Yep, that's all folks. Obviously, fans of the company are going to notice a few glaring omissions, and we do have an answer for that. During my live stream of Card-en-Ciel's demo, the official Inti account took to my chat, you don't see that every day, to deliver the news that, unfortunately, they were unable to include the likes of Blaster Master Zero, Dragon Marked for Death, or Mighty No. 9, simply because Inti are not the sole owner of those IPs. And I imagine it would be a legal headache to acquire permissions from the respective rights owners for a game such as this. A bummer to be sure, but I guess that doesn't rule out the possibility for some crossover DLC down the line. Though officially, Inti could not comment on that possibility for obvious reasons. Honestly, Card-en-Ciel has huge DLC potential, as this is the part where I gotta reel in expectations about the base game. The sequels to many of the games are indeed represented through the cards and some enemies, but that doesn't mean every game gets their own dungeon. When Inti stated that the base game contains around 10 dungeons on their website, they weren't kidding. Which means a good chunk of the featured games are only represented through their cards and enemies that you can fight, who are usually inside the wrong game in true deep log error fashion. For example, you get dungeons for the first entries in the Gunvolt and Luminous Adventure X series, but no sequel dungeons. A couple of the fictional games and even Umbra Claw gets no dungeon whatsoever. So yeah, don't worry, you don't have to expect 3 different Galgun dungeons. They aren't that crazy, I think. But that's also why I think additional dungeon and card DLC would be a no-brainer. Only time will tell if it happens. At least for now, we get a glimpse into what an English dub for Gunvolt 1 would have sounded like, since the voice actors for the established characters reprised their roles. I thought that was neat. Oh, speaking of the devil, I think the massive voice cast featured in Card-en-Ciel did a fine job. The annoyances mainly come from the repetitive voice lines being played in and out of dungeons. Thankfully, you can mute voices in the options for a quieter experience, or switch over to Japanese voices if you prefer. As for Card-en-Ciel's story itself, well, it's definitely an Inti story alright. Except at least this time, the plot is easy to follow along. Neon steals the show here. He's certainly a huge nerd, but a good guy at heart. And his English actor nails the delivery during both the chill and intense moments. On the flip side, we unfortunately have to put up with the ecchi side of Inti as well. Because as we know, their inner Galgun dev seeps through a lot of things. Part of it creeps in with some of the featured games and some of the character designs. But as I detailed during the preview, a fair chunk of it revolves around Ansi's character. I mentioned before how she constantly hits on Neon when navigating the base menu, as if we were playing a dating sim or something. And of course, the godforsaken lap pillow button. Oh dear. And I hate to say that her portrayal doesn't get all that much better in the full game, because I discovered the running gag between Neon and Ansi. You see, every single dungeon usually begins with Neon explaining the game to Ansi, and once he's finished, Ansi takes an opportunity to use a game reference to throw out a pickup line towards Neon. Like this example from the Luminous Adventure X dungeon.
How does the idea of me locking onto you sound? I'll make sure to dash full force into you!
As you can see, Neon always reacts to some variation of, auntie? And it's not even because he's a dense protagonist, because he does mention going on a date together on a couple of occasions, so the feelings are mutual. I think he's just as taken aback by Auntie's flirtatious advances as we are. To quote the official Inti Creates Twitter X account, Auntie may be a little forward, but we promise she means well. A little forward may be the understatement of the entire year, but yeah, that sums her up. Well, despite all the red flags flying around, their relationship does turn out to be pretty wholesome, but I can do without Auntie reminding me of her feelings every 10 seconds. That's not an exaggeration, I timed it. Again, this is where the mute button comes in handy. Somebody who was absent in the demo is the villain, Sullivan Nanocht, who shows up every few dungeons. He is after the error fragments that Neon has been collecting from mod dungeons so that he can reshape the world as he sees fit. Sounds like a typical anime villain plot to me, but turns out he actually has a relatable reason for pursuing such a lofty goal. He's still in the wrong, mind you, but at least his motivations have some actual depth. Albeit, Card-en-Ciel relies heavily on large info dumps at the last possible moment to get the point across. There is also an exposition on part of Neon's backstory that doesn't seem to go anywhere, it just doesn't become relevant again outside of the scene where it is explained. Kind of weird, but I suppose it is a limitation of the game's stage progression. Then we have Nanocht's beloved muse partner, Rita, who falls outside of what I'm allowed to show. Still, I can at least tell you what is shown in the story trailer. Rita's whole gimmick is she can shut off access to your own muses, which is rather oppressive as it stops most of your combo potential. So finding a way to counteract Rita's immobilizing power will be key to defeating Nanocht. Overall, I enjoyed Nanocht's alien design and accent when he speaks. Pretty amusing villain, I would say. Usually stories in roguelite games feel like an afterthought, but thanks to the stage selection structure, Inti was able to craft a fairly riveting tale, complete with the drama, plot twists, and alternate endings that fans have come to expect by now. I'm not sure if it's going to end up among my top Inti stories of all time, but I still enjoyed it for what it was. It was refreshing to come away from an Inti game without feeling absolutely depressed for a change. Alright, here's where we get down to the gameplay. And friendly reminder that Card-en-Ciel is a roguelite. And you know what that means! Each time you enter a dungeon, your deck gets reset to a small basic starter deck. And you will have to build it up from scratch with cards converted from mods after battle or those found in treasure. To help in a pinch, there is the wild card mechanic that, within limitations, allows you to bring in cards from your stock for a one-time use for that dungeon when you need it. Anyway, the deck reset combined with the randomized dungeon layouts means that in essence, no two runs will be the same, as the type of cards you draw influences your strategic decisions. That said, there is a limited pool of cards you can find in each dungeon that revolves around a few different archetypes of cards that work well together, such as amp cards that provide a buff when you use the card for movement rather than attacking, reboot cards that forge an extra copy of themselves in your hand when used, and the setup cards that gain an additional powerful effect when there are exactly 5 cards in your hand. There is a ton more, and each new dungeon you come across generally introduces a new card mechanic, or at least mixes up the pool of available archetypes, keeping the gameplay feeling fresh as you'll be forced to utilize many different strategies and decks throughout the storyline, while also limiting the amount of mechanics being thrown in your face all at once. There is one bonus dungeon that lets you experience what would happen if all 300 plus cards were in the pool, but other than that, I believe that limiting the scope was the right choice. Among the enemies that you will encounter, there will also be recruitable muses that provide powerful effects when their musical performance starts, once you fulfill their conditions. Yep, this is a mechanic that could only come from the Gunvolt studio. These muses generally pair well together with specific card archetypes, one of my favorites being the muse that enables setup effects regardless of the number of cards in hand. What's more, you can theoretically have an infinite number of muses activated at once in battle, which, like I said before, results in massive combo potential. Get enough muses going and you can steamroll any foe in your path. If you love anime styled music, the muses will provide part of the appeal of this game with around 50 different songs, ranging through multiple genres, multiple games, including returning music from the Gunvolt series, and hey, there's even a couple of English songs in there too. If I had to choose my favorite new song to listen to, it would be Rose Vermillion's You Are the Reason. It's a banger, as many of the tracks are. You begin battles with a fresh hand of 5 cards and 3 cost points. The top left number on each card tells you how many points they consume, and once you run out of cost points, you aren't going to be able to do much other than pass your turn. The game does heavily incentivize winning battles in as few turns as possible, so paying close attention to your cost points, card effects, and how cards synergize with each other is the key to success. When you pass your turn, you actually dump your remaining hand and draw a new one, so there is no reason not to use every card you can and try to get the maximum value out of your turn. Even without cost points, it's still possible to use up your amp cards to buff yourself for the next turn, or exhaust your hand in general to trigger a muse or other card effect. You should also be mindful of those glowing panels underneath your feet, because that is where the enemy will launch their attack once you pass, or when the time counter next to them reaches 0. Their counter, well, counts down for every card that you use, which means that they can attack you in the middle of your turn too. So that's another little wrinkle to keep track of. That's why cards can alternatively be used to move Neon out of harm's way. The direction the card moves you is shown underneath their cost. And I have come to notice during my playtime that red cards always move up, blue cards go down, then green and yellow cards can be either left or right. Something to keep in mind so you can visually see your movement options at a glance. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this game's difficulty can be tough, especially if you're going for a perfect rank, and many of my deaths were a result of me not paying attention to the directional movements of my cards and finding myself in unfortunate situations. Legit, one time when I was fighting the tactical communication boss, the man summoned a turret that, combined with everyone else's attack patterns, put me in a checkmate position with no hope for escape. Welp, guess I'll die. I can see why 99% of the time you fight no more than 2 enemies at once. Cards come in 5 categories denoted by their color. Red cards deal HP damage, blue cards deal break damage, and a mechanic that reminds me of the Trails of Cold Steel games, enemies will have a blue break number next to their HP, known as balance. If you deplete that, the foe will break down to a state where their attacks will cease and your attacks deal double damage to them for the rest of your turn. Break attacks have the added benefit of reducing your opponent's attack strength, so if you manage to nerf their damage to 0, you won't have to dodge. Also, their break gauge doesn't replenish between turns, so you can choose to delay breaking them down until you get a good combo in hand. Although if you do stagger them, you get 1 cost point back to help extend your combo. So it's up to you to weigh the benefits of waiting or going all out that turn. Other categories include green cards that are your standard support cards that grant beneficial bonus effects. Yellow cards have the action ability. If you activate them when the enemy's time counter is at 1, you can counter their attack if you time your button press correctly, opening up yet another method to avoid damage. Enemies can start to hit like a truck the further you go into a dungeon, and you don't naturally replenish HP between battles, so you should absolutely be dodging and reducing damage taken as much as possible. Each of the aforementioned cards has a more powerful version of itself known as a special skill. That can mean extra damage, additional effects, more powerful versions of their effects, or all of the above. You utilize special energy denoted by the musical notes underneath your remaining cost to activate them. Triggering a muse earns you 1 blue note per activation, which allows for a free skill use. Another reason why muses are absolutely broken. However, if you go ahead and use the 1 red note, that will cause the card to become fractured, rendering them completely useless and essentially a dead card in your hand should you draw it again. Yup! Fractured cards remain in your deck unless you find a way to get rid of it. So I say only use the red note energy if you are truly desperate. There's definitely lots of micro decisions to make if you want to be efficient and go for the best rank, which is achieved by going for 1-turn kills as much as humanly possible and balancing the power of your deck with the amount of enemies that you ignore. In battle, there is almost an overwhelming amount of elements to keep track of at a given moment. Do I have enough break cards to stagger my opponent? Or enough resources to go for game this turn? Will I be able to get my combo off before I'm interrupted by an enemy attack? You know, this one card is powerful, but it's the only one in my hand that moves me out of harm's way. Do I have to waste it on movement, or do I have another way to avoid damage? What's the order I should be playing my cards to get the most value out of my turn? And part of the decision making starts on the dungeon map before you enter battle. The enemy formations consist of 2 minor enemies that you can easily take out in 1 or 2 turns. I've learned it's easiest to go for these at the start for some easy rewards to help jumpstart you a bit. Then there's single but beefier guardians that power up enemies in adjacent panels, known as erosion levels. They're recruitable muses that you have to be mindful of their placement as well, since they will not only increase erosion level, but establish a negative rule for battles within adjacent panels to them. And lastly, each floor's boss that will have the highest stats and most complex attack patterns. There are always 3 floors to a dungeon, no matter what, and on the 3rd and final floor, there will be an optional elite boss that adds extra points to your score if you defeat them. Just be careful because elite bosses are damage sponges and hit like a monster truck, so only face them if you are confident in your deck. At least they drop legendary cards for your trouble, but I mean, if you can beat the elite boss, you can definitely finish the dungeon. Winning a battle and opening a treasure lets you choose from 3 random cards, and their rarity can be boosted if you win a higher erosion level battle, from rare cards to legendary cards. Sometimes you may also see cheat codes appear, additional special effects that are then applied to every copy of that card in your deck, just like star cards in the Mega Man Star Force series. Hey, remember that game? Adding yet another layer to how broken you can become. Now, you may be tempted to run past every enemy because that's how you achieve a high score, right? But the game does have a mechanic in place to punish you for skipping too much. Every panel that you touch, your memory gauge fills up, and when it reaches critical levels, you have a high chance of setting off a trap event that incurs a penalty rule for all battles on that floor until you subjugate the panel. You don't want this to happen if it can be helped. Clearing out a panel of all foes reduces your memory gauge and results in a subjugation bonus. You can choose from recovering HP, which is more crucial than you think, since the only other way to heal is by finding recovery in a treasure. Furthermore, recovery lowers your memory gauge significantly more, which almost makes the choice worth it alone. Enhance allows you to apply a cheat code to one of 3 random cards in your deck, and Position lets you place a muse or card in that panel, granting a bonus to adjacent panels. Very useful for preparing for a boss fight, since a Position muse automatically activates at the start of the battle. Each subjugation bonus is important in their own way at the right moment, so I recommend you choose wisely. One last thing to be mindful of are the random events that can occur after winning a battle. Similar to a board game, random events set up a scenario that has you obtaining cards removing cards, sacrificing HP for greater rewards, and more depending on your choice. After trouncing the final boss, you will be graded on your run. Again, clearing the dungeon in the least amount of turns and fighting the least amount of battles on your way to the boss will be the largest factors in your score. Of course, no battles means no rewards for you, so it's all a balancing act between grinding for a better deck and choosing your battles to prioritize speed. Achieving 3 medal runs is no small feat, but doable with the right strategy and luck of the draw. Based on your performance, you obtain decode tokens for earning high medal ranks and leveling up, which can be spent in the home base on plugins that power up Neon in various ways, ranging from increasing the chance of rare card drops, maximum HP, additional wildcard slots, to even upgrading specific cards with permanent cheat codes. This is the main way to progress your character between runs, and there's no chance of missing any upgrades, so keep using decode tokens until you unlock it all. Additionally, there are a ton of unlockable hard modes for every dungeon that not only increase enemy stats and add new boss skills, but they also introduce special rule sets that add a wrinkle to how you approach battles. The higher difficulties do get very rough indeed, but the sheer number of levels add a metric ton of replayability to the game, so they are a welcome addition. Alright, we're finally getting into the 2 alternate gameplay modes that we get access to in the full game. Starting with Grand Battle Dungeons, which appear in the real world in true Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth fashion every time the Nox shows his mug to steal our error fragments. So, Neon and Ansi have to log out and go face Nanoct within. Due to the fact that these dungeons exist outside of the virtual realm, the administrative limitations on our deck are gone. Thus, we are allowed to utilize every card within our card library. Hooray! But hold your horses, because there's a catch. That means I will once again have to set some expectations. No, you will sadly not be able to build your own deck. There appears to be no mode in the game at all that lets you do that, probably because it would be quite broken. Instead, every card in your stock will be used for your deck, meaning all of the cards that you've acquired up till now. So if you want to have a better chance at Grand Battle Dungeons, well, what are you waiting for? Go back and get some more cards. Come on. The amount of identical copies of each card you can have in your deck is determined by Neon's level. The more cards you have, the higher your HP, because your deck becomes your HP in grand battles, meaning that every time you take damage, the size of your deck decreases along with it, and when you hit 0 cards, it's game over. For the sake of science, I did test what would happen if you kept milling cards until your deck reaches 0 cards naturally. Well, in my case, once that happened, the deck proceeded to refill itself with a new batch of cards anyway. So it turns out that decking yourself out isn't possible in grand battles unless you lose all of your HP. Interesting. Although, since every card in your stock becomes your deck, I wonder if some players, particularly speedrunners, will try to craft their save files in such a specific way that only cards they want to take into grand battles are chosen during their runs. Kinda like how Mega Man Bound Number 4 and 5 players would manipulate the Dark Soul AI by carefully selecting which chips are used. Oh man, that would be wild to see. Regardless, the Grand Battle Dungeons are a breath of fresh air, since you literally start out all powerful from the beginning. Something I didn't mention yet is that in addition to having all of your cards, you also have every muse you have collected throughout the game on standby. And as we established, there's a lot of muses. So, no joke, there are times that I had like 10 or more muses trigger in succession all at once. I was sitting there for a couple minutes just mashing the A button trying to get through all the animations that were starting up. and my blue special energy filled up in the blink of an eye because of that, just by playing normally. Yup, it's as absolutely broken as you can imagine, and I'm loving it. Furthermore, instead of acquiring new cards, any battle rewards that you get simply enhance your deck's cards with cheat codes, as if you weren't overpowered already. To help draw out the pacing of the dungeon so you don't just skip to the boss every time, the memory gauge does fill up a lot faster than normal, so you're forced to participate in more battles if you don't want any traps. Other than all of those differences, the dungeon plays out pretty normally until the battle against the Noct himself, who will present the biggest challenge, especially when he has Rita in tow. It is a bummer that we may never get to craft a Gunvolt themed deck and the like, but putting that aside, Grand Battle dungeons are fun to power trip around in, even if it's clear that these were designed to be power checks for the player and mainly meant to carry the storyline forward. There's still additional difficulties to try though. Finally, I bet you're curious about that online PvP mode that's been advertised. Yeah, yeah, me too. You see, the mode is online only and I could not find any other players during the review period for obvious reasons, so I was out of luck for actually playing it. I'm not entirely empty-handed though, because the game has a tutorial screen for PvP battles, and I will say the rule set is a bit different from what I pictured. Once again, there's no opportunity to build your own deck in PvP, as both players receive a randomly generated starting deck and get to choose one muse at the start. Network battles themselves play out quite differently from what we're used to in single player battles. The most fundamental change is that both players choose their cards simultaneously, as opposed to taking turns like a traditional card game. The first player to choose their card gains a stats boost depending on how much faster they selected over the other player, which is an interesting way to incentivize people to make quick decisions rather than taking the whole 30-second timer to decide. Cards are used in order from the turn player. You may also choose to pass your turn without choosing a card. Maybe you can play some mind games with your opponent that way to bait them into wasting cards. Bear in mind, however, that if both players pass their turn this way, the round ends automatically and the turn player switches over. Of course, you're going to be forced to pass your turn anyway if your hand runs empty. When the round ends, both players choose a new card to add to their hand. The turn player changes over, and the process repeats until someone's HP is depleted. One more wrinkle to the whole thing is that now the player will have a balance gauge as well. If you get put into breakdown, you lose all of your stat boosts, and your entire hand is automatically discarded. Yikes. Furthermore, once someone enters breakdown, the round will end in 30 seconds, so I assume that would be your moment to get a combo in before time runs out. Welp, that's all that's written on PvP. On paper at least, it seems like an interesting and surprisingly balanced way of handling PvP. Kinda reminds me of BattleNetwork6's random battle mode, but more complex and, you know, not exactly Battle Network. It would be wild if Inti somehow bypassed the balancing pitfalls of early Battle Network PvP on the first go. However, the only way to find out if PvP is any good is to actually try it. Gotta test for latency and all that jazz too. Perhaps I'll give it a go in a future stream. Before the verdict, I want to take a moment to touch on performance and presentation, because there was quite the difference between the Nintendo Switch and Steam ports. On PC, the game has a ton of frame rates and resolution options, and with my setup, I could get the frame rate as high as a buttery smooth 144 FPS. The game played flawlessly with ultra responsive controls and instant load times both on my admittedly overkill PC rig and on Steam Deck too, although on Steam Deck I was running at 60 FPS, which made the switch to Nintendo's handheld that much more jarring, as the Nintendo Switch version targets 30 FPS, and even though I don't have a frame counter, I could tell it wasn't always a consistent 30 FPS with some minor frame dips here and there when the screen got busy. Furthermore, load times are longer and more frequent, interrupting gameplay in areas that they wouldn't on PC, even while navigating the base menu. Lastly, after moving to Switch, I noticed that I would sometimes accidentally buffer an input during battles. If I fire off a card attack and press A again while the animation is still playing out, Neon will automatically chain into the next card the cursor is over. Now, I'm willing to wager that this is more a feature than a sign of oppressive input lag, but it may be worth mentioning, I don't know. It did cause me an accidental input at least a couple times. Regardless, the good news is Card-en-Ciel is 99% a turn-based card game, and the only time you would need precise timing is when countering with action cards. So even if the controls are a little less responsive, the game remains perfectly playable. Still, I did find myself bummed out how comparatively unoptimized the game feels on Switch, as I could tell that it was struggling a bit to run the engine. I haven't tried the PlayStation or Xbox ports, but hopefully those run better than this. I will say that if playing this game on the go is important to you, Switch is still perfectly fine, but if you are fortunate enough to own a Steam Deck, I would recommend you get the game on that instead. Don't forget that Steam users that pre-ordered Card-en-Ciel also gets the Divine Dynamo Flame Frit game as a bonus, ahead of the game's full release later this winter. On the subject of presentation, I will echo my preview in that my only real gripe is the lack of visual variety in the dungeons. Yes, the background does change depending on the game and situation, but I would have liked to see some additional visual flair over the areas themselves, because right now the dungeon design suffers some heavy Bound Network 1 syndrome. Ironic. All that said, like Addicting, I won't hide my feelings. Card-en-Ciel, for all its occasional cringe-worthy elements, is cancelled out by how dang fun it is. From simply watching the trailers, it was hard to tell how the gameplay systems would turn out, but once I finally got to sit down and play it, take it all in on the game's terms, I genuinely believe that Inti has a winning formula on their hands. I enjoy the various strategies available, how the game makes me put on my thinking cap to combat its difficulty while simultaneously providing enough power trips to make the adrenaline flow. Sure, it sucks when I do die on the 3rd floor of a dungeon at the very end, but in retrospect, that's still less time commitment than a lot of roguelites that don't give you breaks between levels. No, this isn't a replacement for Battle Network, nor was it ever going to be, but Card-en-Ciel stands tall among its contemporaries in the card battling RPG genre through its own merits, and it may genuinely have the best storyline of any roguelite that I've seen, with no outside reference material needed to boot. Unless you count all the featured games, I guess. And hey, you gotta love how many of the fictional games they came up with are parodies of real-life existing games, like Digimon for example. Did you know that a dev working on Card-en-Ciel also worked on a Digimon game in the past? That's another tidbit that Inti shared on my live stream last month. So, is Card-en-Ciel worth $25 US? Listen, I already put over 20 hours into this game, and that is just from playing straight through the storyline. There is still many hours to go to play all the harder difficulty levels, unlock all the plug-in upgrades, and go for the 3 medal ranks. The answer is heck yeah! You'll be getting your money's worth for the amount of hours you'll be sinking into this game, especially for 100% completion. If I had to give this game a score, it would be a solid 8 out of 10. A great game with room for growth that hopefully a potential sequel could address. Oh boy, if a sequel does come, if we just look at how BN2 basically saved that franchise, with the massive difference between BN1 and BN2, oh man, we are going to be in for a treat. If there is any DLC to come down the line for this game, I'll be playing it. For now, I have a massive amount of difficulty levels to grind through for tens of hours more. Thank you all so much for watching, especially if you made it this far, kudos to you. Be sure to stay tuned to ShadowRockZX for more on Card-en-Ciel, Inti Crates, and of course, all things Mega Man. Until the streams and more, rock on and have a wonderful time zone.